When an elderly woman sitting in the audience whispered something, Steve Harvey dropped the microphone and ran to her side. The studio lights were blazing. The cameras were rolling. Two families stood at their podiums, buzzers ready, smiles wide. Steve Harvey was in his element, cracking jokes, working the crowd, making everyone feel like they were part of something bigger than a game show. It was just another taping of Family Feud. Or so everyone thought. Then, in the middle of round 3, something happened that no one, not the producers, not the crew, not even Steve himself, saw coming. A woman in the front row of the audience, elderly and frail, raised her hand slightly. Not to wave. Not to cheer. Just a small, trembling gesture. And she whispered something. The microphones didn't catch it. The cameras weren't focused on her. But Steve Harvey saw her. And in that instant, everything stopped. He put down the card he was holding. He stepped away from the podium. And without a word to anyone, he walked off the stage and into the audience. The contestants looked at each other in confusion. The producers behind the monitors froze. The audience held its breath. Because Steve Harvey, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes, who knew every beat of the show by heart, had just broken every rule in the book. Steve stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. If you want to understand why this moment became one of the most powerful in television history, subscribe now. Because the most important part of this story is still ahead. Her name was Dorothy Miller. She was 78 years old. She had come to the Family Feud taping with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. It was supposed to be a fun day, a break from the routine, a chance to see the show they watched together every evening. Dorothy had been a fan of Steve Harvey for years. Not just because he was funny, but because of something deeper. Something she had never told anyone outside her family. 30 years earlier, Dorothy's son, her only son, had been struggling. He was 22, lost, battling addiction, and pushing everyone away. One night he disappeared. Dorothy searched for weeks. She called hospitals, shelters, police stations. Nothing. Then, one evening, a young man showed up at her door. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't a social worker. He was a struggling comedian named Steve Harvey, who had been performing at a small club where Dorothy's son had been sleeping in the alley behind the building. Steve had found him there, shivering and hungry. And instead of calling the authorities or walking away, Steve sat with him. He bought him food. He talked to him for hours. And when Dorothy's son finally admitted who he was and where he came from, Steve drove him home. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't want recognition. He just said, "Your mama's been looking for you. Go home." Dorothy never forgot that. Her son got clean. He rebuilt his life. And years later, when he passed away from a heart condition, one of the last things he told his mother was, "That man saved my life, Mama. Steve Harvey saved my life." Dorothy had always wanted to thank him. But life went on. Steve became famous. And she assumed he would never remember a random act of kindness from 3 decades ago. Until today. Until she was sitting in that audience, watching him on stage, and the words just came out of her mouth. "He was my angel." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. The cameras kept rolling, but no one gave instructions. The teleprompters went blank. The audience sat in stunned silence as Steve Harvey knelt down in front of Dorothy Miller. He wasn't Steve Harvey the host anymore. He wasn't Steve Harvey the comedian. He was just a man, looking into the eyes of a woman who was holding on to a memory that had shaped her life. "What did you say, ma'am?" Steve asked quietly. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. The microphone in his hand was forgotten. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice shaking. "But you saved my son. 30 years ago. Behind that comedy club. You brought him home to me." For a moment Steve didn't move. Then his face changed. The smile faded. His eyes widened. And something in him broke open. "I remember," he said. His voice cracked. "I remember your son. I remember that night. The audience gasped. Some people started crying. The contestants on stage were frozen, unsure whether to stay or leave. But Steve didn't care about the show anymore. He reached out and took Dorothy's hands in his. "How is he?" Steve asked. "How's your boy?" Dorothy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He passed, baby. 5 years ago. But he lived a good life. He got clean. He got married. He had children. And he always said you were the reason. He called you his angel." The weight of those words hit Steve like a freight train. He had spent decades making people laugh, but in that moment, laughter was the furthest thing from his mind. He thought about all the nights he had struggled as a young comedian, sleeping in his car, wondering if he would ever make it. He thought about all the times he had questioned whether any of it mattered. And here, sitting in front of him, was the answer. "What was his name?" Steve asked, his voice barely audible. "Marcus," Dorothy whispered. "Marcus Anthony Miller." Steve closed his eyes. The memory came flooding back, not just of that night, but of the conversation they'd had. Marcus had told him about his mother, about how she worked 2 jobs to keep him fed, about how he had let her down. And Steve had told him something he hadn't thought about in years. "Your story isn't over yet, brother. This is just a chapter. A bad one. But you get to write the next one." "I remember Marcus," Steve said, opening his eyes. "I remember him telling me about you. About how much he loved you. About how ashamed he was." Dorothy nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "He wasn't ashamed when he came home," Steve continued. "I made sure of that. I told him that courage isn't never falling down. It's getting back up. And he did that. He got back up. That wasn't me. That was him. That was you, raising him to know he was worth saving. Steve Harvey, the man who had made millions laugh, the man who never seemed rattled, broke down. Right there, in front of everyone, he cried. He pulled Dorothy into his arms and held her like she was his own mother. The studio was silent except for the sound of people weeping. Even the crew members were wiping their eyes. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve didn't let go. He didn't rush back to the show. Instead, he stood up, still holding Dorothy's hand, and he turned to the audience. "You all need to hear this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This woman's son, I didn't save him. He saved himself. I just gave him a ride home. But she's been carrying this gratitude for 30 years. 30 years. And I forgot. I forgot about that night until right now." He looked back at Dorothy. "You didn't have to thank me. But you did. And that," his voice broke again, "that's everything." Then he did something no one expected. He took off his jacket, the custom-tailored suit jacket he was famous for, and he draped it over Dorothy's shoulders. "You keep this," he said. "Because if I was your son's angel, then you're mine today. You reminded me why I do what I do. Not for the cameras. Not for the laughs. For moments like this." The audience erupted. People were standing, clapping, crying. The two families on stage had abandoned their podiums and were hugging each other and wiping away tears. Even the opposing team, who moments earlier had been locked in competition, were now united in something much bigger than a game. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, right there on stage, and he called someone. The audience watched, confused, as he put the call on speaker. A voice answered. "Steve! What's going on? We're in the middle of a taping. I need you to do something for me." Steve interrupted. It was one of the producers. "I need you to find out who this woman's grandchildren are. I need you to set up college funds for them. Today. Right now." The audience lost it. Dorothy tried to protest, but Steve shook his head. "Your son made something of his life because somebody gave him a second chance. I'm making sure his kids get every chance they deserve." Dorothy's daughter, who had been sitting silently beside her mother, broke down completely. She stood up and wrapped her arms around Steve, sobbing into his shoulder. "You don't understand," she cried. "We've been struggling. My kids, Marcus's kids, they're so smart, but we didn't know how we were going to send them to college." Steve held her, patting her back like a father would. "You don't have to worry about that anymore," he said firmly. "Your daddy gave me something that night. He gave me perspective. He reminded me that we're all just trying to find our way home. And now I'm paying that forward. That's what Marcus would want." The cameramen, who had been filming the entire exchange, were struggling to keep their cameras steady through their own tears. The director, watching from the control room, made a decision in that moment. This footage was too powerful, too raw, too sacred to be edited into a game show episode. This was something else entirely. Subscribe and share this story, because what Steve Harvey did next changed everything. After the show wrapped, an hour later than scheduled, with no one complaining, Steve didn't leave. He stayed with Dorothy and her family. They sat in the green room, and for 2 hours they talked. Dorothy showed him pictures of her son, wedding photos, pictures of his kids, moments from a life that had been saved and rebuilt. Steve looked at every single one. He asked questions. He laughed at stories. He cried again. And then he made another call. This time, it was to his own foundation. He arranged for Dorothy's entire family to be flown out to one of his charity events. He wanted them there. Not as guests. As honored family. Before they left, Steve handed Dorothy something. It was a small card with his personal phone number written on it. "You call me anytime," he said. "I mean it. Anytime." Dorothy looked at the card, then at Steve, and she said something that would stay with him forever. "My son told me you didn't just drive him home that night. He said you prayed with him. You told him God wasn't done with him yet. I don't know if you remember that. But I need you to know, you were right. God wasn't done with him. And God's not done with you either." Steve nodded, unable to speak. He hugged her one more time, and as her family led her out of the studio, he stood there, watching them go, his jacket still draped over her shoulders. That jacket never came back. Dorothy kept it. She framed it in her living room, right next to a picture of her son. And every time Steve Harvey was asked about that day, by reporters, by fans, by people who had seen the viral clip, he would smile and say, "That wasn't about me. That was about her. That was about remembering that the smallest things we do can be the biggest things in someone else's life." The footage of that moment was never officially aired as part of a Family Feud episode. But it was captured by audience members on their phones, and within days, it had been viewed over 50 million times. People from all over the world commented, sharing their own stories of strangers who had changed their lives. The moment became bigger than Steve. It became a reminder of something we all forget too easily, that we have the power to be someone's angel, even if we never know it. Steve Harvey's career didn't change after that day. But he did. He started a new initiative through his foundation, dedicated to helping young men struggling with addiction and homelessness. He called it the Angel Project. And every year, on the anniversary of that Family Feud taping, he would post a picture of Dorothy Miller, wearing his jacket, with the caption, "She reminded me why I'm here." Dorothy passed away 2 years after that taping. She was surrounded by her family, and in her hands she held 2 things, a rosary, and Steve's business card. At her funeral, Steve Harvey showed up unannounced. He sat in the back, quietly, and when it was over, he walked up to her casket and placed something inside, a folded piece of paper. No one knew what it said except Steve. But later Dorothy's daughter found a copy of it in her mother's belongings. It was a prayer. The same prayer Steve had said with Dorothy's son 30 years earlier, behind that comedy club, in an alley that no one remembers. "God, you're not done with him yet. And you're not done with me. Help us remember that every single day is a second chance. Amen." That prayer is now engraved on a bench outside Steve Harvey's foundation headquarters. And next to it there's a plaque. It reads, In memory of Dorothy Miller, who reminded us all that angels walk among us, and sometimes, they just need a ride home. This is the legacy of one moment. One woman. One memory. One man who stopped a show because he realized that some things are bigger than entertainment. Some things are bigger than fame. Some things are eternal.